Galapagos by Kurt Vonnegut. Part 3, Chapters 17 through 22. Read by Ron Gabaldon. 17. On the island of Manhattan, a middle-aged American publicity man contemplated the collapse of his masterpiece, which was the nature cruise of the century. He had just moved into new offices within the hollow crown of the Chrysler Building, formerly the showroom of a harp company which found itself bankrupt, like the city of Ilium and Ecuador and the Philippines and Turkey, and on and on. His name was Bobby King. He was in the same time zone as Guayaquil, and a line drawn due south from the deep crease in his brow to just below the equator would have found a terminal in an even deeper crease in the brow of Andrew McIntosh in Guayaquil. McIntosh was trying to shout life into a dead telephone. McIntosh might as well have been holding a stuffed Galapagos marine iguana alongside his boxy head as he cried out ever more imperiously, "Hello! Hello!" Bobby King had a stuffed Galapagos marine iguana on his desk, had in fact amused more than one visitor by pretending that he had mistaken it for his telephone, holding it alongside his head and saying, "Hello! Hello!" He was in no joking mood now, though, surely. In his own way, he had done as much as Charles Darwin to make the Galapagos Islands famous, with a 10-month campaign of publicity and advertising which had persuaded millions of people all over the planet that the maiden voyage of the Bahia de Darwin would indeed be the nature cruise of the century. In the process, he had made celebrities of many of the island's creatures, the flightless cormorants, the blue-footed boobies, the larcenous frigate birds, and on and on. His clients were the Ministry of Travel of Ecuador, Equatoriana Airlines, and the owners of the Hotel El Dorado and the Bahia de Darwin, the paternal uncles of Siegfried and Captain Adolph Von Kleist. Neither the hotel manager nor the captain had to work for livings, incidentally. They were fabulously well-to-do through inheritance, but felt that they should keep busy all the same. It now appeared to King, although he had not been told so yet, that his work had been for nothing, that the nature cruise of the century would not take place. As for the stuffed marine iguana on his desk, he had made that reptile the totemic animal for the cruise, had caused its image to be painted on either side of the Bahia de Darwin's bow, and to appear as a logo in every ad and at the top of every publicity release. In real life, the creature could be more than a meter long, and look as fearsome as a Chinese dragon. Actually, though, it was no more dangerous to life forms of any sort, with the exception of seaweed, than a liverwurst. Here is what its life is like in the present day, which is exactly what its life was like a million years ago. It has no enemies, so it sits in one place, staring into the middle distance at nothing, wanting nothing, worried about nothing, until it is hungry. Then it waddles down to the ocean and swims slowly, and not all that ably, until it is a few meters from shore. Then it dives like a submarine and stuffs itself with seaweed, which is at that time indigestible. The seaweed is going to have to be cooked before it is digestible. So the marine iguana pops to the surface, swims ashore, and sits on the lava in the sunshine again. It is using itself for a covered stew pot, getting hotter and hotter while the sunshine cooks the seaweed. It continues to stare into the middle distance at nothing, as before, but with this difference. It now spits up increasingly hot salt water from time to time. During the million years I have spent in these islands, the law of natural selection has found no way to improve, or, for that matter, to worsen this particular survival scheme. King knew that 6 persons had actually reached Guayaquil, and were in the Hotel El Dorado at that very moment, still expecting to take the nature cruise of the century. This was a minor shock to him. He had assumed that those who had made their own arrangements to get there would surely stay away, since the news from the area was so bad. He had the names of all 6. One was entirely unknown to him, a Canadian named Willard Fleming. This was actually James Waite, of course. King could not imagine how this person had gotten onto the passenger list, which, with the exception of Mary Hepburn and a Japanese veterinarian and his wife, was supposed to be composed of newsmakers and trendsetters of the highest potency. It puzzled King that Mary Hepburn was down there, but not her husband Roy. He hadn't heard that Roy was dead. And he knew something about the Hepburns, even though they were complete nobodies on a passenger list of celebrities, because they were the very first persons to sign up for the Nature Cruise of the Century. That was at a time when King had reason to doubt that any really famous person would be induced to make the trip. When the Hepburns signed on, in fact, King had played with the idea of turning them into mini-celebrities somehow, with appearances on talk shows and newspaper interviews and so on. He would never meet them, but he did talk to Mary on the telephone, hoping against hope that there might be something interesting about the Hepburns, even though they held the most ordinary sorts of jobs in a drab industrial town with the highest unemployment rate in the country. One or the other might have a famous ancestor or relative, or Roy might have been a hero in some war, or they might have won a lottery, or they might have suffered a recent tragedy, or whatever. And parts of King's conversation with Mary back in January had gone like this. "Well, I am a distant relative of Daniel Boone," she said. "My maiden name was Boone, and I was born in Kentucky." "That's wonderful," said King. "You're his great-great-granddaughter or what?" "I don't think it's quite that direct," she said. "It never meant much to me, so I never tried to get it straight." "But your maiden name was Boone." "Yes, but that's just a coincidence. My father's name was Boone, and he wasn't any relative of Daniel Boone. I'm related to Daniel Boone on my mother's side." "If your father's name was Boone and he was a Kentuckian, then he had to be related to Daniel Boone in some way, do you think?" said King. "Not necessarily," she said, "because his father was a horse trainer from Hungary named Miklos Gombos, who changed his name to Michael Boone." On the subject of prizes or honors she or Roy might have won, Mary said that her husband certainly deserved plenty of them for all the good work he had done at Gefco, but that the company didn't believe in anything of that sort, except for its very top executives. "No military medals? Nothing like that?" he said. "He was in the Navy," she said, "but he didn't fight." If King had called 3 months later, of course, and gotten Roy on the phone, he would have received an earful about Roy's tragic exploits during the bomb tests in the Pacific. "You have children?" said King. "Not in the usual sense," said Mary, "but I consider every student a child of mine, and Roy is active in scouting, and he considers every member of his troop to be a son of his." "Well, that's a wonderful attitude," said King, "and it has been awfully nice to talk to you, and I hope you and your husband enjoy the trip." "I'm sure we will," she said, "but I still have to get up enough nerve to tell the principal that I want 3 weeks off right in the middle of a semester." "You'll have so many wonderful things to tell your students when you get back," said King, "that he'll be glad to let you go." King, incidentally, had never seen the Galapagos Islands firsthand, and never would. Like Mary Hepburn, he had seen plenty of pictures of them. "Oh," said Mary as he was about to hang up, "you were asking about honors and prizes and medals and all that." "Yes," said King. "I'm just about to get a kind of prize, or what feels like a prize to me. I'm not supposed to know about it, so I probably shouldn't tell you about it." "My lips are sealed," said King. "I just happened to find out by accident," said Mary. "But this year's senior class is going to dedicate its yearbook to me. They gave me a nickname in the dedication, which I just happened to see in a print shop where I was picking up some birth announcements for a friend. She had twins, a boy and a girl." "Aha!" said King. "Do you know the nickname those nice young people are giving me?" said Mary. "No," said King. "Mother Nature personified," said Mary. And there are no tombs in the Galapagos Islands. The ocean gets all the bodies to use as it will. But if there were a tombstone for Mary Hepburn, no other inscription would do but this one: Mother Nature personified. In what way was she so like Mother Nature? In the face of utter hopelessness on Santa Rosalia, she still wanted human babies to be born there. Nothing could keep her from doing all she could to keep life going on, and on, and on. 18. When Bobby King heard that Mary Hepburn was one of the 6 unfortunate enough to have reached Guayaquil, he thought about her for the first time in months. He thought that perhaps Roy was with her, since they had sounded like such an inseparable couple, and that his name had been omitted accidentally by the Hotel El Dorado's manager, whose teletyped communications were becoming more hectic by the hour. King knew about me, by the way, although not by name. He knew a workman had been killed during the building of the ship. But he no more wanted to publicize this piece of information, which might imply to the superstitious that the Bahia de Darwin had a ghost, than the Von Kleist family wished it known that one of its members was hospitalized with Huntington's chorea, and that 2 more of its members had a 50-50 chance of being carriers of that disease. Did the captain ever tell Mary Hepburn during their years together on Santa Rosalia that he might be a carrier of Huntington's chorea? He revealed that terrible secret only after they had been marooned 10 years, and he realized that she had been playing fast and loose with his sperm. Of the 6 guests at the El Dorado, King was acquainted with only 2, Andrew McIntosh and his blind daughter Selina, and of course Kazak, Selina's dog. Anybody who knew the McIntoshes also knew the dog, although Kazak, thanks to surgery and training, had virtually no personality. The McIntoshes were frequenters of several restaurants which were King's clients, and McIntosh, but not the dog and the daughter, had been on talk shows with some of his clients. King had watched the shows with Selina and the dog on a backstage monitor. It was his impression that the daughter had little more personality than the dog when she wasn't right next to her father, and her father was all she could talk about. Andrew McIntosh certainly enjoyed his exposure on talk shows. He was a welcome guest on them because he was so outrageous. He held forth about what fun life was if you had unlimited money to spend. He pitied and scorned people who weren't rich, and so on. Thanks to the rigors of Santa Rosalia, Selina would develop a personality very distinct from her father's before she went down the blue tunnel into the afterlife. She would also be fluent in Japanese. In the era of big brains, life stories could end up any which way. Look at mine. After Roy and Mary Hepburn, the McIntoshes and the Hiraguchis were the next people to join the passenger list for the nature cruise of the century. That was in February. The Hiraguchis were to be McIntosh's guests, and they would travel under false names so that Zenji Hiraguchi's employers would not discover that he was negotiating a business deal with McIntosh. As far as King and Siegfried von Kleist and anybody else connected with the cruise knew, the Hiraguchis were the Kenzaburus, and Zenji was a veterinarian. That meant that fully half of the guests at the El Dorado weren't who they were supposed to be. As a fill-up to all this big-brained deceiving going on, Mary Hepburn's war-surplus combat fatigues still bore the embroidered last name of their previous owner over the left breast pocket, which was Kaplan. And when she and James Waite finally met in the cocktail lounge, he would tell her his false name, and she would tell him her true name, but he would keep calling her Mrs. Kaplan anyway, and extol the Jewish people and so on. And they would later be married by the captain on the sundeck of the Bahia de Darwin, and as far as she knew, she had become the wife of Willard Fleming, and as far as he knew, he had become the husband of Mary Kaplan. This sort of confusion would be impossible in the present day, since nobody has a name anymore, or a profession, or a life story to tell. All that anybody has in the way of a reputation anymore is an odor which, from birth to death, cannot be modified. People are who they are, and that is that. The law of natural selection has made human beings absolutely honest in that regard. Everybody is exactly what he or she seems to be. When Andrew McIntosh signed up for 3 staterooms on the Bahia de Darwin's maiden voyage, Bobby King had reason to be mystified. McIntosh had a private yacht, the Omu, which was nearly as large as the cruise ship, and so could have gone to the Galapagos Islands on his own, without submitting to the close contacts with strangers and the disciplines which would be imposed by the nature cruise of the century. The cruise passengers, for example, would not be able to go ashore whenever they pleased, and to behave there however they pleased. They were to be escorted and supervised at all times by guides, all of them trained by scientists at the Darwin Research Station on Santa Cruz Island, and all of them holding graduate degrees in one of the natural sciences. So when King, making his rounds of restaurants and clubs one night, saw Macintosh and his daughter and her dog and 2 other people having a late supper in a celebrity hangout called Elaine's, he stopped by their table to say how pleased he was that they were taking the cruise. He wanted very much to hear why they were taking it, so that he might use their reasons as inducements for other newsmakers to come along. Only after greeting the Macintoshes did King realize who the other 2 people at the table were. He knew them both to speak to, and he did so now. The woman was the most admired female on the planet, Mrs. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis, and her escort that evening was the great dancer, Rudolf Nureyev. Nureyev, incidentally, was a former citizen of the Soviet Union who had been granted political asylum in Great Britain, and I was still alive then, and I was a United States citizen who had been granted political asylum in Sweden. Yes, and we both liked to dance. At the risk of reminding Macintosh that he owned an ocean-going yacht, King asked him what he had found so attractive about the Bahia de Darwin. Macintosh, who was highly intelligent and well-read, thereupon delivered a speech on the damage selfish and ignorant persons had done to the Galapagos Islands while going ashore unsupervised. This material was all lifted from an article in the National Geographic magazine, which he read from cover to cover every month. The magazine's point was that Ecuador would require a navy the size of the combined fleets of the world to keep persons from going ashore on the islands and doing as they pleased, so that the fragile habitats could be preserved only if individuals were educated to exercise self-restraint. No good citizen of the planet, said the article, should ever go ashore unless escorted by a well-trained guide. When Mary Hepburn and the captain and Hisako Hiraguchi and Selina Macintosh and the rest of them were marooned on Santa Rosalia, they would not have a trained guide along, and for their first few years there, they would raise perfect hell with the fragile habitat. Just in the nick of time, they realized that it was their own habitat they were wrecking, that they weren't merely visitors. There in Elaine's restaurant, Macintosh angered his spellbound audience with tales of boots crushing the camouflage nests of iguanas, of greedy fingers stealing the eggs of boobies, and on and on. His most moving atrocity story by far, though, again lifted from the National Geographic, was of persons cradling fur sea pups in their arms as though they were human infants, for the sake of photographs. When the pup was returned to its mother, he said bitterly, she would no longer nurse it because its smell had been changed. So, what happens to that darling pup, which had just had the great honor of being cuddled by a big-hearted nature lover? Asked Macintosh. It starves to death, all for the sake of a photograph. So his answer to Bobby King's question was that he was setting a good example he hoped others would follow by taking the nature cruise of the century. It is a joke to me that this man should have presented himself as an ardent conservationist, since so many of the companies he served as a director, or in which he was a major stockholder, were notorious damagers of the water or the soil or the atmosphere. But it wasn't a joke to Macintosh, who had come into this world incapable of caring much about anything. So, in order to hide this deficiency, he had become a great actor, pretending even to himself that he cared passionately about all sorts of things. With the same degree of conviction, he had earlier given his daughter an entirely different explanation of why they were going to the islands on the Bahia de Darwin instead of the Omu. The Hiraguchis might feel trapped on the Omu, with nobody but the Macintoshes to talk to. They might panic under such circumstances, and Zenji might refuse to negotiate anymore, and asked to be put ashore at the nearest port so that he and his wife could fly back home. Like so many other pathological personalities in positions of power a million years ago, he might do almost anything on impulse, feeling nothing much. The logical explanations for his actions, invented at leisure, always came afterwards. And let that sort of behavior back in the era of the big brains be taken as a capsule history of the war I had the honor to fight in, which was the Vietnam War. 19. Like most pathological personalities, Andrew McIntosh never cared much whether what he said was true or not, and so he was tremendously persuasive. And he so moved the widow Onassis and Rudolf Nureyev that they asked Bobby King for more information about the nature cruise of the century, which he sent to them on the following morning by special messenger. As luck would have it, there was going to be a documentary about the lives of blue-footed boobies on the islands shown on educational television that evening, so King enclosed notes saying they might want to watch it. These birds would later become crucial to the survival of the little human colony on Santa Rosalia. If those birds hadn't been so stupid, so incapable of learning that human beings were dangerous, the first settlers would almost certainly have starved to death. The high point of that program, like the high point of Mary Hepburn's lectures on the islands at Ilium High School, was film footage of the courtship dance of the blue-footed boobies. The dance went like this. There were these two fairly large seabirds standing around on the lava. They were about the size of flightless cormorants, and had the same long snaky necks and fish spear beaks. But they had not given up on aviation, and so had big, strong wings. Their legs and webbed feet were bright, rubbery blue. They caught fish by crashing down on them from the sky. Fish, fish, fish! They looked alike, although one was a male and the other was a female. They seemed to be on separate errands and not interested in each other in the least, although there wasn't much business for either one of them to do on the lava, since they didn't eat bugs or seeds. They weren't looking for nesting materials, since it was much too early in the game for that. The male stopped doing what he was so busy doing, which was nothing. He caught sight of the female. He looked away from her, and then back again, standing still and making no sound. They both had voices, but at no point in the dance would either make a sound. She looked this way and that, and then her gaze met his accidentally. They were then 5 meters apart or more. When Mary showed the film of the dance at the high school, she used to say at this point, as though she were speaking for the female, "What on earth could this strange person want with me? Really? How bizarre!" The male raised one bright blue foot. He spread it in air like a paper fan. Mary Hepburn, again in the persona of the female, used to say, "What is that supposed to be? A wonder of the world? Does he think that's the only blue foot in the islands?" The male put that foot down and raised the other one, bringing himself one pace closer to the female. Then he showed her the first one again, and then the second one again, looking her straight in the eye. Mary would say for her, "I'm getting out of here." But the female didn't get out of there. She seemed glued to the lava as the male showed her one foot and then the other one, coming closer all the time. And then the female raised one of her blue feet, and Mary used to say, "You think you've got such beautiful feet? Take a look at this, if you want to see a beautiful foot. Yes, and I've got another one, too." The female put down one foot and raised the other one, bringing herself one pace closer to the male. Mary used to shut up then. There would be no more anthropomorphic jokes. It was up to the birds now to carry the show, advancing toward each other in the same grave and stately manner, neither bird speeding up or slowing down. They were at last breast to breast and toe to toe. At Ilium High School, the students did not expect to see the birds copulate. The film was so famous since Mary had shown it in the auditorium in early May as an educational celebration of springtime for years and years that everybody knew they would not get to see the birds copulate. What those birds did on camera, though, was supremely erotic all the same. Already breast to breast and toe to toe, they made their sinuous necks as erect as flagpoles. They tilted their heads back as far as they would go. They pressed their long throats and the undersides of their jaws together. They formed a tower, the two of them, a single structure, pointed on top and resting on 4 blue feet. Thus was a marriage solemnized. There were no witnesses, no other boobies to celebrate what a nice couple they were or how well they had danced. In the film Mary Hepburn used to show at the high school, which was the same film Bobby King thought Mrs. Onassis and Rudolf Nureyev might enjoy watching on educational television, the only witnesses were the big-brained members of the camera crew. The name of the film was Sky Pointing, the same name big-brained scientists gave to the moment when the beaks of both birds were pointed in the direction exactly opposite to the pull of gravity. And Mrs. Onassis was so moved by this film that she had her secretary call Bobby King the next morning to inquire if it was too late to reserve 2 outside staterooms on the main deck of the Bahia de Darwin for the nature cruise of the century. 20. Mary Hepburn used to give her students extra credit if they could write a little poem or essay about the courtship dance. Something like half of them would turn something in, and about half who did thought the dance was proof that animals worshipped God. The rest of the responses were all over the place. One student turned in a poem which Mary would remember to her dying day, and which she taught to mandarax. The student was named Noble Claggett, and he would be killed in the war in Vietnam. But there his poem would be, inside of mandarax, along with bits by some of the greatest writers who ever lived. It went like this. Of course I love you, so let's have a kid. Who will say exactly what its parents did? Of course I love you, so let's have a kid. Who will say exactly what its parents did? Of course I love you, so let's have a kid. Who will say exactly what its parents did? Etc. Noble Claggett, 1947 to 1966. Some students would ask permission to write about some other Galapagos Islands creature, and Mary, being such a good teacher, would of course answer, yes. And the favorite alternates were those teasers and robbers of the boobies, the great frigate birds. These James Waits of the bird world survived on fish which boobies caught, and got their nesting materials from nests which boobies built. A certain sort of student found this hilarious, and such a student was almost invariably male. And a unique physical feature of male great frigate birds was also bound to attract the attention of immature human males concerned with erectile performances of their own sex organs. Each male frigate bird at mating time tried to attract the attention of females by inflating a bright red balloon at the base of his throat. At mating time, a typical rookery when viewed from the air resembled an enormous party for human children, at which every child had received a red balloon. The island would in fact be paved with male great frigate birds with their heads tilted back, their qualifications as husbands inflated by their lungs to the bursting point, while overhead the females wheeled. One by one, the females would drop from the sky, having chosen this or that red balloon. After Mary Hepburn showed her film about the great frigate birds, and the window shades in the classroom were raised and the lights turned back on, some student, again almost invariably a male, was sure to ask, sometimes clinically, sometimes as a comedian, sometimes bitterly, hating and fearing women, "Do the females always try to pick the biggest ones?" So Mary was ready with a reply as consistent, word by word, as any quotation known by mandarax. To answer that, we would have to interview female great frigate birds, and no one has done that yet, so far as I know. Some people have devoted their lives to studying them, though,
and it is their opinion that the females are in fact choosing the red balloons which mark the best nesting sites. This makes sense in terms of survival, you see. And that brings us back to the really deep mystery of the blue-footed boobies' courtship dance, which seems to have absolutely no connection with the elements of booby survival, with nesting or fish. What does it have to do with, then? Dare we call it religion? Or, if we lack that sort of courage, might we at least call it art? Your comments, please.
The courtship dance of the blue-footed boobies, which Mrs. Onassis suddenly wanted to see so much in person, has not changed one iota in 1,000,000 years. Neither have these birds learned to be afraid of anything. Neither have they shown the slightest inclination to give up on aviation and become submarines. As for the meaning of the courtship dance of the blue-footed boobies, the birds are huge molecules with bright blue feet and have no choice in the matter. By their very nature, they have to dance exactly like that. Human beings used to be molecules which could do many, many different sorts of dances, or decline to dance at all, as they pleased. My mother could do the waltz, the tango, the rumba, the charleston, the lindy hop, the jitterbug, the watusi, and the twist. Father refused to do any dances, as was his privilege. 21. When Mrs. Onassis said she wanted to go on the nature cruise of the century, then everybody wanted to go, and Roy and Mary Hepburn were almost entirely forgotten, with their pitiful little cabin below the waterline. By the end of March, King was able to release a passenger list headed by Mrs. Onassis and followed by names almost as glamorous as hers: Dr. Henry Kissinger, Mick Jagger, Paloma Picasso, William F. Buckley Jr., and of course, Andrew McIntosh and Rudolf Nureyev and Walter Cronkite, and on and on. Zenji Hiroguchi, traveling under the name Zenji Kenzaburo, was said in the release to be a world-famous expert in animal diseases, so as to make him seem more or less in scale with all the other passengers. 2 names were left off the list as a matter of delicacy, so as not to raise the embarrassing question of who they were exactly, since they were really nobody at all. They were Roy and Mary Hepburn, with their pitiful little cabin below the waterline. But then this slightly bob-tailed list became the official list. So when Equatoriana Airlines in May sent a telegram to everybody on the list, notifying them that there would be a special overnight flight for any of them who happened to be in New York City on the evening before the Bahia de Darwin was to sail, Mary Hepburn was not among those notified. Limousines would pick them up anywhere in the city and take them to the airport. Each seat on the plane could be converted into a bed, and the tourist seats had been replaced with cabaret tables and a dance floor, where a company from the Ecuadorian Ballet Folklorico would perform characteristic dances of various Indian tribes, including the fire dance of the elusive Cancabonos. Gourmet meals would be served, along with wines worthy of the greatest restaurants in France. All this would be free of charge, but Roy and Mary Hepburn never heard about it. Yes, and they never got a letter that everybody else got in June from Dr. Jose Sepulveda de la Madrid, the president of Ecuador, inviting them to a state breakfast in their honor at the Hotel El Dorado, followed by a parade in which they would ride in horse-drawn carriages decked with flowers from the hotel to the waterfront, where they would board the ship. Nor did Mary get a telegram King sent to everybody else on the 1st of November, which acknowledged that storm clouds on the economic horizon were indeed worrisome. The economy of Ecuador, however, remained sound, so that there was no reason to believe that the Bahia de Darwin would not sail as planned. What the letter didn't say, although King knew it, was that the passenger list had been cut approximately in half by cancellations from virtually every country represented there but Japan and the United States, so that almost everybody still intent on going would be on that special flight from New York City. And now,
King's secretary came into his office to tell him that she had just heard on the radio that the State Department had just advised American citizens not to travel in Ecuador at the present time. So that was that for what King considered the finest piece of work he had ever done. Without knowing anything about naval architecture, he had made a ship more attractive by persuading its owners not to call it, as they were about to do, the Antonio Jose de Sucre, but the Bahia de Darwin. He had transformed what was to have been a routine 2-week trip out to the islands and back into the nature cruise of the century. How had he worked such a miracle? By never calling it anything but the nature cruise of the century. If, as now seemed certain to King, the Bahia de Darwin would not set out on the nature cruise of the century at noon the next day, certain side effects of his campaign would endure. He had taught people a lot of natural history with his publicity releases about the wonders which Mrs. Onassis and Dr. Kissinger and Mick Jagger and so on would see. He had created 2 new celebrities. Robert Pepin, the chef King had declared to be the greatest chef in France, after hiring him to run the galley for the maiden voyage, and Captain Adolph Von Kleist, the captain of the Bahia de Darwin, who, with his big nose and air of hiding some unspeakable personal tragedy from the world, had turned out to be on television talk shows a first-rate comedian. King had in his files a transcript of the captain's performance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. On that show, as on all others, the captain was dazzling in the gold and white uniform he was entitled to wear as an admiral in the Ecuadorian Naval Reserve. The transcript went like this. Carson. Von Kleist. Doesn't sound like a very South American name somehow. Captain. It's Inca. One of the commonest Inca names, in fact, like Smith or Jones in English. You've read the accounts of Spanish explorers who destroyed the Inca Empire because it was so unchristian. Carson. Yes? Captain. I assume you've read them. Carson. They're on my bedside table, along with Ecstasy and Me, the autobiography of Hedy Lamarr. Captain. Then you know that 1 out of every 3 Indians they burned for heresy was named Von Kleist. Carson. How big is the Ecuadorian Navy? Captain. 4 submarines. They are always underwater. They never come up. Carson. Never come up. Captain. Not for years and years. Carson. But they keep in touch by radio. Captain. No. They maintain radio silence. It is their own idea. We would be glad to hear from them, but they prefer to maintain radio silence. Carson. Why have they stayed underwater for so long? Captain. You will have to ask them about that. Ecuador is a democracy, you know. Even those of us in the Navy have a very wide latitude in what we can or cannot do. Carson. Some people think Hitler might still be alive and living in South America. Do you think there is any chance of that? Captain. I know there are persons in Ecuador who would love to have him for dinner. Carson. Nazi sympathizers. Captain. I don't know about that. It's possible, I suppose. Carson. If they would be glad to have Hitler for dinner, or... Captain. Then they must be the cannibals. I was thinking of the cancabonos. They are glad to have almost anybody for dinner. They are... What is the English word? It's on the tip of my tongue. Carson. I think I'll pass on this one. Captain. The cancabonos are... Carson. Take your time. Captain. Aha! They are apolitical. That's the word. Apolitical is what the cancabonos are. Carson. But they are citizens of Ecuador. Captain. Yes, of course. I told you it was a democracy. One cannibal, one vote. Carson. There is a question which several ladies have asked me to ask you, and maybe it is too personal. Captain. Why a man of my beauty and charm should never have tasted the joys of marriage? Carson. I've had some experience in these matters myself, as you may or may not know. Captain. It would not be fair to the woman. Carson. Well, now things are getting too personal. Let's talk about blue-footed boobies. Maybe now is the time to show the film you brought. Captain. No, I'm perfectly willing to discuss my failure to plight a troth. It would not be fair of me to marry a woman, since at any time I might be given command of a submarine.
Carson. And then you would have to go under and never come up again.
Captain.
That is the tradition.
King sighed massively. The passenger list was on his desktop, with about half the names crossed off. Mexicans and Argentinians and Italians and Filipinos and so on, foolish enough to have kept their fortunes in their own national currencies. The names remaining, save for the 6 persons already in Guayaquil, were all in the New York City area, easily reached by telephone.
I guess we'll have some telephoning to do,
King said to his secretary. She offered to do the calling. He said, no. It was not a duty he felt free to delegate. He had persuaded all these celebrities to take part in the cruise, had wooed the most potent newsmakers among them as a lover might. Now he was going to have to give them the bad news personally, as a responsible lover should. At least he wouldn't have much trouble finding most of them. There were 42 of them, counting mates or companions who were non-entities, but they had organized themselves into a few dinner parties, duly reported in gossip columns that day, in order to pleasantly pass the hours remaining until limousines came to cushion and muffle them away to Kennedy International Airport for Equatoriana's special 10 o'clock flight to Guayaquil. And at least he wouldn't have to talk about getting back their money for them. The trip wasn't to have cost them a nickel, and they had already received free matched luggage and toiletries, and Panama hats besides. For the sad amusement of himself and his secretary, King now played his joke with the stuffed marine iguana. He picked it up and held it alongside his head, as though it were a telephone, and he said, Mrs. Onassis, I'm afraid I have some disappointing news for you. You're not going to get to see the courtship dance of the blue-footed boobies after all. King's apologetic telephoning was a gallant formality. No one still expected to board the plane at 10 that night. By 10 that night, incidentally, Andrew McIntosh, Zenji Hiraguchi, and the captain's brother Siegfried would all be dead, and would all have completed their short journeys through the Blue Tunnel into the afterlife. All the people on the passenger list that King talked to had already made new plans for the coming 2 weeks. Many would go skiing within the safe boundaries of the United States instead. At one dinner party for 6, everybody had already decided to go to the Combination Fat Farm and Tennis Camp in Phoenix, Arizona. And the last call King made before leaving his office was to a man who had become a very close friend during the past 10 months, who was Dr. Teodoro Donoso, a poet and physician from Quito, who was Ecuador's ambassador to the United Nations. He had earned his medical degree at Harvard, and several other Ecuadorians King had dealt with had been educated in the United States. The captain of the Bahia de Darwin, Adolph Von Kleist, was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. The captain's brother, Siegfried, was a graduate of the Cornell Hotel School at Ithaca, New York. There was a lot of noise from what sounded like a wild party going on at the embassy, which Dr. Donoso suppressed by closing a door. "What are those people celebrating?" King asked. "It's the ballet folklorico," said the ambassador, "rehearsing the fire dance of the Cancabonos." "They don't know the trip's been called off?" said King. It turned out that they did know, and that they intended to stay in the United States in order to earn dollars for their families back home by performing in nightclubs and theaters, a dance Bobby King had made so famous in his publicity, the fire dance of the Cancabonos. "Are there any real Cancabonos in the bunch?" said King. "My guess is that there aren't any real Cancabonos anywhere," said the ambassador. He had in fact written a 26-line poem called The Last Cancabono, about the extinction of a little tribe in the Ecuadorian rainforest. At the start of the poem, there were 11 Cancabonos. At the end, there was just one, and he wasn't feeling well. This was an exercise in fiction, however, since the poet, like most Ecuadorians, had never seen a Cancabono. He had heard that the tribe was down to only 14 members, so that their final extinction by the encroachments of civilization seemed inevitable. Little did he know that in a matter of less than a century, the blood of every human being on Earth would be predominantly Kankabono, with a little Von Kleist and Hiraguchi thrown in. And this astonishing turn of events would be made to happen in large part by one of the only two absolute nobodies on the original passenger list for the nature cruise of the century. That was Mary Hepburn. The other nobody was her husband, who himself played a crucial role in shaping human destiny by booking, when facing his own extinction, that one cheap little cabin below the waterline.
22. Ambassador Donasso's 26 lines of mourning for the last Kankabono were premature to say the least. He should have wept on paper for the last mainland South American, and the last mainland North American, and the last mainland European, and the last mainland African, and the last mainland Asian instead. He guessed right, at any rate, as to what was going to happen to the morale of the people of Ecuador within the next hour or so, when he said to Bobby King on the telephone, "Everybody down here is just going to fall apart when they find out that Mrs. Onassis isn't coming after all." "Things can change so much in 30 days, said King. The nature cruise of the century was supposed to be just one of the many things Ecuadorians had to look forward to. Suddenly it became the only thing.
"It is as though we prepared a great crystal bowl of champagne punch," said Donoso, "and then, overnight, it turned into a rusty bucket of nitroglycerin."
He said that the nature cruise of the century had at least postponed Ecuador's facing up to its insoluble economic problems for a week or two. The governments of Colombia to the north and Peru to the south and east had already been overthrown, and were now military dictatorships. The new leaders of Peru, in fact, in order to divert the big brains of their people from all their troubles, were just about to declare war on Ecuador.
"If Mrs. Onassis were to go there now," said Donoso, "people would receive her as though she were a rescuer, a worker of miracles. She would be expected to summon ships laden with food to Guayaquil, and to have United States bombers drop cereal and milk and fresh fruit for the children by parachute."
Nobody nowadays, I must say, expects to be rescued from anything once he or she is more than 9 months old. That's how long human childhood lasts nowadays. I myself was rescued from folly and carelessness until I was 10 years old, until Mother walked out on Father and me. I was on my own after that. Mary Hepburn didn't become independent of her parents until she received her master's degree at the age of 22. Adolph Von Kleist, the captain of the Bahia de Darwin, was regularly bailed out by his parents from gambling debts and charges of drunken driving and assault and resisting arrest and vandalism and so on until he was 26, when his father came down with Huntington's chorea and murdered his mother. Only then did he begin to assume responsibility for mistakes he made. Back when childhoods were often so protracted, it is unsurprising that so many people got into the lifelong habit of believing, even after their parents were gone, that somebody was always watching over them. God or a saint or a guardian angel or the stars or whatever. People have no such illusions today. They learn very early what kind of world this really is, and it is a rare adult indeed who hasn't seen a careless sibling or parent eaten alive by a killer whale or shark. A million years ago, there were passionate arguments about whether it was right or wrong for people to use mechanical means to keep sperm from fertilizing ova, or to dislodge fertilized ova from uteri in order to keep the number of people from exceeding the food supply. That problem is all taken care of nowadays without anybody's having to do anything unnatural. Killer whales and sharks keep the human population nice and manageable, and nobody starves. Mary Hepburn used to teach not only general biology at Ilium High School, but a course in human sexuality, too. This necessitated her describing various birth control devices which she herself had never used, since her husband was the only lover she had ever had, and she and Roy had wanted to have babies from the very first. She, who had failed to get pregnant despite years of profound sexual intimacies with Roy, had to admonish her students about how easy it was for a human female to get pregnant from the most fleeting, insensate, seemingly inconsequential contact with a male. And after she had been teaching a few years, most of her cautionary tales involved students she had known personally, right there at Ilium High School. Scarcely a semester passed at the high school without at least one unwanted pregnancy, and during the memorable spring semester of 1981, there were 6. And, true enough, about half of these babies having babies spoke of true love for those with whom they had mated. But the other half swore, in the face of contradictory evidence which could only be described as overwhelming, that they had never, to the best of their recollection, engaged in any activity which could result in the birth of a child. And Mary would say to a female colleague at the end of the memorable spring semester of 1981, "For some people, getting pregnant is as easy as catching cold." And there certainly was an analogy there. Colds and babies were both caused by germs which loved nothing so much as a mucous membrane. After 10 years on Santa Rosalia Island, Mary Hepburn would discover firsthand exactly how easy a teenage virgin could be made pregnant by the seed of a male who was seeking sexual release and nothing else, who did not even like her.